Welcome to a very special editorial on the Boomer Bust channel. I'm your host, Terry, and today I'm going to be doing what's becoming my annual statistical analysis of the top quarterbacks against playoff competition. So if you haven't seen this, I've done it the prior 2 years. You can check that out. But I'll walk you through it. It'll be, I think, pretty attainable concepts that's not too crazy. But if you follow me, you know that I'm not the biggest believer in stats. There's a lot of people that try to claim that either I don't know stats or I'm against it, whatever. I'm not against it, and I definitely know it. Stats, data, that's kind of my job, actually, in real life. So I actually do know how to break this stuff down, but I do know that numbers can lie and can be manipulated the way you want, and they don't always tell the full context. So that's my biggest thing. But there's certain ways to do some, I think, useful exercises, and this is one that I like to do each year. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take the top 10 quarterbacks from the past season by their QB rating. And I always say, I don't know what the QB rating is. Maybe they put the explanation out, but every time I've looked, I've never really seen what goes all into the QB rating. Supposedly, it's supposed to take into consideration not just the passing, but the running and all that. So we're going to use QB rating as the marker. I'm not endorsing it, but that's the most commonly known one, so that's what we're going to go with. So we're going to use QB rating. And that we take the top 10 quarterbacks, and then from there, I start to look at their stats versus the playoffs teams, and we'll kind of walk through those. So the first thing that we'll look at is the top 10 from last year. So Aaron Rodgers was number 1 in QB rating, and then he'll be number 1 again. And we got a couple faces that's obviously going to be missing. Drew Brees has since retired. And then Deshaun Watson did not play this year. So obviously they'll be missing off the list. But if we look at the list for this year, you'll see some new faces and a lot of familiar faces. So again, you have Aaron Rodgers still at number 1. And you have Tom Brady returning along with Kirk Cousins, Russ Wilson, and Pat Mahomes. And added to the list some new faces. We got Joey Burrow, we got Jimmy G, Kyla Murray, Dak Prescott, and Matt Stafford. I don't know if those are the names that you would automatically think. Right on the outside was Justin Herbert, and I think Josh Allen. I wouldn't say right on the outside, but Justin Herbert was right on the outside of this. But not too shocked. The only one that really got me was Russ Wilson. But again, you look at the overall body, he did his job. So this is our top 10. This is, again, ranked by their overall QB rating, 1 through 10. The first thing we're going to look at is their QB rating against playoff teams. So we have a shift here. Joe Burrow is number 1, moving up a spot. Dak Prescott moves up 1 spot. You have Pat Mahomes jumps up 7 spots, and Jimmy G jumps up 5 spots. And then we have Aaron Rodgers goes down 4 spots. And then Russ Wilson goes down a large number 2. Now, the thing about this that you're going to see be a consistent pattern is that those that play against more playoff teams, for the most part, you're going to see that be a big factor. Not always. So Aaron Rodgers, he's tied for least playoff games or least games against playoff teams with Tom Brady. They both only played 5 teams. And then after that is Joe Burrow at 6, along with Kyla Murray. And then Pat Mahomes leads the way with 9, and right behind him is Russell Wilson with 8. So they played a lot of playoff teams. Now, depending on the stat we're looking at, that's going to affect them in different ways. But either way, this is how the top 10 shakes out when you look at their QB rating, their average QB rating, I should say, against playoff teams. And now these are the quarterbacks that had a better QB rating versus playoff teams than they did overall. And so when we look at that, number one is going to be Joe Burrow himself, and very closely behind him is Dak Prescott. You're talking about, for Dak Prescott, almost 6 points higher. And then with Joe Burrow, you're talking about 3 points higher, a little over 3 points higher for him. So they really excelled against playoff teams in comparison to their overall. And then you have, again, Pat Mahomes, who was really good. I mean, like I said, you saw how many spots he jumped up. His overall QB rating was not what it was last year or prior. And it was pretty low by his standards. I mean, by everybody's standards. He was the last one in the top 10. But against playoff teams, you saw that he really excelled. And then again for Jimmy G. So all of these guys played a good amount of playoff teams, which in, logical, you might think that their rating could be lower, even though they had a high overall rate. When you play a lot of playoff teams, you might think your rating would be lower because you're playing more competition, but they did well. So that's the overall rating. From there, we're going to go to attempts. Who is throwing the ball the most? So when we look at who's throwing the ball the most, this is the top 10 overall. You got, I don't think a surprise, Tom Brady, Mahomes, Stafford, they're all at the top. These are schemes that have the quarterback throw the ball a whole lot. And in Tom Brady's case, by far, in a way, I mean, Pat Mahomes was kind of close, but Tom Brady was at 719, Pat Mahomes at 658. So they're throwing the ball a lot. And that stands to reason. But then what I did this year that is a little different than what I've done in the years past is I looked at percentages. Last year, I used to look at attempts per game, so I would average it out. But now we're looking at percentages. So these are the people who throw the most. But now I want to see who or how much of your attempts are coming against playoff teams. And so then we go to our next slide, and we see a similar group, except you add Russ Wilson. And actually, Russ Wilson is number one, and you'll see him kind of pop up a good amount. 57.5% of Russell Wilson's attempts came against playoff teams. Now, the thing that you're going to notice quickly is, if you haven't noticed already, all 4 NFC West quarterbacks are in this top 10. And that's the quarterback. I don't know that necessarily changes anything about the numbers, but we know 3 of those teams went to the playoffs. So obviously, if you're in that division, you played more playoff games than probably other people. And so Russ Wilson again played 8. 8 games were against playoff teams. So you're talking about and I forgot how many games he actually played in, but almost half the schedule for him was against playoff teams. So a lot of his throws came against playoff teams, which I think is how you could start thinking about him having this down year. And again, he made the top 10 in QB rating, and so that's cool. But still, a lot of his throws came against there. Then you got Jimmy G, Pat Mahomes, and they both were over 50%. And then Dak Prescott was at 48%. So very close to half his attempts came against playoff teams. All right, so then we move on to completions. Again, kind of the overall. And I don't think this is a shock again. That's going to be a similar list to the attempts, because I think the people that throw more probably have more yards, more, everything. So you got Tom Brady, number one, Mahomes, Dak, Stafford. They're all in that top 4. Kirk Cousins, surprisingly, ahead of Burrow and Aaron Rodgers, in my opinion. That's just not something I would have thought of off the top of my head. But you see that there. And then the rest of the list, that kind of falls into line. So again, the question becomes, out of all your completions, so these are our top people. Out of all your completions, who's completing who's completing the most passes against playoff teams? And then we go to our list. That's the exact same. You're going to see these guys pop up a lot. Russ Wilson leads again. 56% of all his completions came against playoff teams. Jimmy G, Pat Mahomes, both over 50%. Dak Prescott, 49.8, right at the cusp. So, and I think there's a bit of a drop off after this when you look at the rest of the numbers. And so these four were kind of in their own separate group where they're playing a lot of quality competition. So again, and I think it's more impressive when you talk about a guy, actually you talk about two guys, Pat Mahomes and Dak Prescott, because they're both towards the top in overall completions, even though half of their completions came against playoff teams. So again, this analysis is about who is playing competition. And so for the last two, attempts, and when you talk about, well, actually, no. So Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers are tied. Actually, no, I'm sorry. I am jumping ahead. That's something else. We'll talk about that in a second. They are close, but Aaron Rodgers is last as far as completions against playoff teams. And Tom Brady's right after him. And they're kind of in their own tier down at the bottom. So when you're talking about who completed the most passes against non-competition, quote unquote, it's Aaron Rodgers. Followed closely by Tom Brady. And then when you talk about attempts, Tom Brady was last and kind of by far. He was kind of by far last. So Tom Brady he was in attempts, he was throwing the least against playoff teams. And then Aaron Rodgers was next and Joe Burrow was right next to him. And when you talk about completions, it's kind of the same story. Joe Burrow, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, all kind of towards that bottom group. They're not really the ones that are completing or throwing, for that matter, against playoff teams. And again, Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers are tied for the least amount of playoff or games against playoff teams. So Aaron Rodgers, you're playing in the NFC North. The Lions, the Bears were nowhere near close. Vikings were on the cusp for a while, but you didn't really get there. And then Tom Brady in the NFC South. Again, you had Saints on the cusp, but nobody else really got there. So it kind of makes sense that they're going to be on the lower end of that. But when you shake it out, and I'm not saying the playoff teams are necessarily the best competition, whatever, but obviously that's a common marker we can look at. That if you're a playoff team, that you are, on the top end of the quality. So there we go with that. So the next thing that we're going to look at. So now we're looking at completion percentage. So don't be confused. We first talked about just completions. I got 22 completions this game, whatever. And then you add them up, blah, blah, blah. Now we're talking about completion percentage. So 22 out of 22 is 100%. 10 completions out of 20 attempts, 50%, that type stuff. So number one in the league was Joe Burrow. And very impressive to beat Aaron Rodgers, who we know is very efficient. And that's what this number really is looking at, is really looking at your efficiency. So Joe Burrow was number one. And then after that, Aaron Rodgers, Dak, and Jimmy were very kind of close to each other. Joe Burrow kind of, I would say, significantly was ahead because he had over 2 percentage points. And so there's that. And then at the bottom, we see Kyla Murray, Russ Wilson. So that's, again, overall. So now we want to look at what the completion percentages look like against playoff teams. And so for this, we actually going to redo the chart. And when you look at it, you'll see the Joe Burrow is still number one, even when we're looking at playoff teams. And then we have Dak Prescott. He moved up one, so did Jimmy. But then Pat Mahomes, he comes up 4 spots. So does Kyla Murray, comes up 5 spots. And so when we're talking about when you're playing against those playoff teams, who's doing it either better or at the same rate? And that's obviously, that's good context. You want to know if I'm completing, let's say, 80% of my passes, but I isolate that to just the playoff teams and I'm completing 50% of my passes in those games. That tells you something. Now, it's not that drastic here, but this does tell you. So Joe Burrow still number one. Pat Mahomes significantly better. Kyla Murray significantly better. And then Aaron Rodgers 8 spots down. And so I think part of that is how well the people at the top did. But it shows that Aaron Rodgers, when playing competition, did not do as well. That's just kind of how the numbers shake out. You have Thomas, Stafford, and Kirk all drop 1. Russ stays the same. But the big movement is on Pat and Kyla Murray, where you saw they did a little better. So not going to be too shocking when we look at the QBs that had a better completion percentage against playoff teams. You got Burrow, Mahomes, Jimmy G, Kyla Murray, and Dak Prescott. So Burrow, I mean, obviously you got the best completion in the league. And it's possible. It is very possible, especially because he only played 6 games against playoff teams. It's very possible that he could have had a worse completion percentage if you just look at playoff teams. Although his number 1 completion percentage tells you he's pretty good. But he actually went up pretty high. I mean, 4 percentage points against playoff teams. So it's not a fluke whatsoever. And then Pat Mahomes, even though he goes up all those spots, it's a slight bump. Kyla Murray, 4 percentage points. So that's a big bump too. And then the other guys are around 3 percentage. So Dak Prescott, he played a lot of games against playoff teams, or a good amount. You know, he has 7, so he's right in the middle. But he did better. He did better against the competition. And again, you look at his division, you got the Eagles that came in at the last seed, but that's really it. So they had to play other teams that were of competition. And so looking at kind of the bottom, you got, I mean, we already talked about Aaron Rodgers and everything like that. So those are guys at the bottom. And I think the one that might have surprised me a little bit was Kyla Murray, just because he didn't, I mean, he had a good year to start off, then had a bit of a down year. But still, when you look at the competition, he was completing his passes at least. We can say that much. Okay, so we looked at kind of the efficiency stuff. Now we're going to look at kind of the main numbers that people like. We got yards. So again, overall yards. Tom Brady led the league. Stafford, Mahomes, Burrow. And Burrow is very impressive. When you really think about it, I think we all remember Burrow threw for like 900 some yards in 2 weeks. But you really understand it when you see that he's not up there on attempts. He's not even up there on completions, but he's up there on yards. So he was making the most of all of those opportunities. So that's kind of the people who threw the most yards. Russ Wilson towards the bottom. Now we look at the percentage versus playoff teams. How much of your yards came against playoff teams? And we have a very familiar group. Pat Mahomes, Jimmy G, Dak Prescott, Russ Wilson. And I don't know if you are going to be shocked right now, but Russ Wilson led the group. Russ Wilson was actually the only person over 50%. He was at 52.6%. 52, almost 53% of his yards came against playoff teams. Jimmy G and Dak were at 49 point something, so they were close, and then Pat Mahomes at 48. So very close to half their yards were gained against playoff teams, but Russell Wilson kind of takes that title. And so again, when you have conversation, and this isn't the end all be all, but when you have conversations, this helps kind of frame it where, yes, to me, you could talk about just whatever. And if you're a Bears fan, you listen to my Bears stuff, you know we're a great example of it. You can look at just the bottom line and say whatever. But if you don't look at the context, especially the competition, you might be missing something. The first year with Nagy was one thing and people went crazy. And I before that season, I'm like, well, you got to look at our schedule. It kind of favors us doing that. And so I think that's the same thing. You want to see who's playing competition. So there's that. Next up, touchdowns. And we have the usual suspects towards the top and the bottom. Although Jimmy G's last and Russ Wilson played way worse, but Jimmy G's was last. You know, they're a running team. So these are the people who threw the most touchdowns in the league. And we want to see how many of your touchdowns came against competition. And we have a similar group minus Russ Wilson. And so Pat Mahomes, Jimmy G, and Dak Prescott. So you see a theme, and I'll say this, if you watched the stuff last year or previously, it wasn't like this before. It was definitely more of a hodgepodge, but this year there's a clear difference of which quarterbacks excelled against competition. And so anyway, you got Jimmy G leading with 55% of his touchdowns coming against competition, 54% of Mahomes, and 51% of Dak, which is impressive again because Jimmy G only threw 20. Dak and Mahomes threw 37. So a lot of touchdowns, but again, over half of them coming against competition. On the low end, on the very low end is Tom Brady. Basically 20.9% of his touchdowns came against competition. Right after that, you got Aaron Rodgers at 27%. And we just talked about yards. It's kind of the same thing. Aaron Rodgers and Tom Brady are tied there with 32.7% of their yards coming against competition. So, yes, we could, again, look at the bottom line, but how much are you producing? Or I should say, how much of your production comes against competition? And in that case, for this year, these three kind of stand alone. And then our last one, the interceptions. It's a very weird, it's a very weird dynamic. And I talked about this the last 2 years, and we'll do it again. So for me, first of all, these are listed from least amount of interceptions to most. But for me, you don't want interceptions. But I tend to feel, and you might be different, that if you're going to throw interceptions, I would rather my quarterback be throwing against competition versus throwing against non-competition. So some people would say, and it's a way to spin that, well, it seems like your quarterback can't perform against competition, or, you know, they fold under the lights or whatever. The way I look at it is, I mean, if you got the Jags, the worst team in the league by record, and you throw 4 interceptions against them, what's the line of thinking there? If you, or not even the Jags, just a bad defense. Because I don't know what the Jags defense was ranked, but just say you're going against a bad defense and you throw 4 interceptions. What's the line of thinking there? Versus, oh, we played the Bills, the number 1 pass defense. Okay, we kind of understand why you threw 4 interceptions. So to me, that's the way I look at it. You might not see a good way to rank this, but that's the way that I kind of look at it, is if you're throwing interceptions versus quality comp, I understand that a little more. So again, we know Aaron Rodgers is number 1. He only threw 4 interceptions this year. And I wouldn't say people threw a crazy amount of interceptions this year, which is crazy with an extra game. And then Stafford was down at the bottom with 17 and Burrow with 14. So that's the people who threw the least amount of interceptions from best to worst. Now, again, the question for me is, which person is throwing interceptions against playoff teams? And this is the group we got. We got Russ Wilson, Kirk Cousins, Stafford, Kyla Murray, Jimmy G. And so all four NFC West quarterbacks are represented in this particular one, which, kind of makes sense. But number one is Russ Wilson. Six. All of his interceptions, 100%, came against playoff teams. And again, for as bad as it was this year, to only have 6 interceptions ain't bad. But you threw 6 interceptions, all of them came against a playoff team. You weren't throwing interceptions against lower competition. To me, I think that's good. And you might think the opposite. And so he was by far number one. Then you got Kirk Cousins, who was 57%. Jimmy G, Kyler were exactly half. And then Stafford was 47%, so close to half. And again, I believe that that's what you want. Towards the bottom, you got Aaron Rodgers, 25%. Now, Aaron only threw 4 picks. So 1 interception came against a playoff team. Again, that's the question. Would you rather Aaron Rodgers have had an interception through 4 interceptions against playoff teams or non-playoff teams? I don't know. And so Tom Brady, though, threw 12, and 25% of that was against competition. That, to me, is a problem. If I'm sitting my quarterback, you threw 12 interceptions, and only a quarter of that came against a playoff team. That means you were throwing a lot of interceptions against teams that I probably would say you shouldn't be throwing interceptions against. So that's kind of the way I look at it. So anyway, that is it. That is the breakdown for the 21 season of the top 10 quarterbacks against competition. So we have I won't say realistic, but we have a different perspective on kind of how that looks and what that means. And hopefully that was, beneficial, added something for you. So that's it for me. Go down in the comment section. Let me know what you think. Share it around. Get the conversation started. Thumbs up, subscribe, and thank you for listening.